This will be a quiet, slow reading of several of Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories. The first story is A Scandal in Bohemia. Bohemia is a place. Once, in the late 19th century, the famous detective Sherlock Holmes was visited by Dr. John Watson, his good friend and former roommate. Dr. Watson had moved out after getting married, but often visited Holmes. Holmes still lived at 221 B. Baker Street, a messy but cozy place in London. On this particular evening, Watson came to check on Holmes. Holmes was as sharp as ever and quickly guessed that Watson had been busy with patients. Just then, a letter arrived, brought by a mysterious man wearing a mask. The letter was sealed with a royal symbol, and Holmes knew it was serious. The man introduced himself as a representative of a very important person who needed Holmes' help. Holmes read the letter aloud. It was from the King of Bohemia. He was in trouble and needed Holmes' help urgently. The masked man finally admitted he was the king himself, and he wanted to keep his identity secret. Watson was shocked, but Holmes kept calm. The king explained his problem. He was going to marry a young princess from another country, but he had a secret. Before he met the princess, he had been in love with a famous and beautiful woman named Irene Adler. She was very smart and independent, and they had spent some time together. Irene had a photo of them together that could ruin the king's engagement. He tried to get the photo back, but Irene wouldn't give it to him. The king was worried that if the princess's family found out about Irene, the marriage would be called off. He offered Holmes a large reward if he could find and take the photo from Irene. Holmes agreed to help, not for the money, but because he enjoyed solving difficult cases. Holmes spent the next day learning about Irene Adler. He found out she was smart, kind, and respected in her community. She had many admirers, but was not married. Holmes also discovered that she had a routine. She left her house each day for a walk and returned at the same time. Holmes decided on a plan. He disguised himself as an old groom, or a person who takes care of horses. He waited outside Irene's house, pretending to be hurt. When Irene's carriage arrived, She saw Holmes dressed as the groom and helped him inside. While he was in her house, Holmes noticed where Irene kept her important papers. The next step in Holmes' plan was to find out exactly where the photo was. He returned to Baker Street and asked Watson to help. Holmes explained that he needed Watson to create a distraction the next evening. The next day, Holmes and Watson went to Irene's house. Holmes was disguised as a priest. Watson started the plan by throwing a smoke rocket into the house and shouting, "Fire!" People panicked and ran around. Irene rushed to the spot where she kept her most valuable items, including the photograph. Holmes saw her reaction and knew where the photo was hidden. He left quickly, knowing he had the information he needed. The next morning, Holmes planned to go back to Irene's house with the king and take the photo. But when they arrived, they found the house empty. Irene had left, leaving behind a letter for Holmes. In the letter, Irene wrote that she had figured out Holmes' plan. She had seen through his disguise and realized what he wanted. She decided to leave London with a man she loved and take the photo with her. However, she promised she would not use the photo against the king. Irene wrote that she was now happily married and didn't want to cause any trouble. She even wished the king well. The king was relieved and grateful. He knew that Irene was telling the truth and that she would not interfere with his marriage. He offered Holmes a valuable ring as a reward, but Holmes refused. Instead, he asked for a simple photograph of Irene Adler. Holmes always remembered Irene as the woman who outsmarted him. She had proven to be as clever as he was, and Holmes respected her intelligence and bravery. In the end, Holmes did not solve the case in the way he planned, but he admired Irene for outwitting him. Dr. Watson always thought of that adventure as the time when Sherlock Holmes met his match. The next story is The Red-Headed League. One day, Dr. John Watson visited Sherlock Holmes at 221B Baker Street. Holmes had a new case to discuss. A man named Mr. Jabez Wilson, who had bright red hair, came to see Holmes. Mr. Wilson ran a small pawn shop, but he had a strange story to tell. Mr. Wilson explained that his assistant, a young man named Vincent Spaulding had told him about a job opportunity called the Red-Headed League. This league only hired men with bright red hair, and it paid very well for simple work. Mr. Wilson applied and was accepted because of his unique hair color. The job was easy. Every day, Mr. Wilson had to sit at an office and copy the Encyclopedia Britannica by hand. He was paid a good salary for this, but after a few weeks, he arrived at work to find a note on the door. The Red-Headed League is dissolved. The office was empty, and no one knew anything about the league. Mr. Wilson felt confused and tricked, so he came to Holmes for help. Holmes found the story very interesting and decided to investigate. He visited Mr. Wilson's pawn shop and met Vincent Spaulding, who Holmes noticed was a clever man with a curious mark on his face. Holmes also observed the area around the shop, especially the bank next door. After gathering information, Holmes invited Watson and some police officers to join him that night near the bank. Holmes explained his theory. The Red-Headed League was a trick to keep Mr. Wilson busy while Spaulding, whose real name was John Clay, dug a tunnel from the pawn shop's basement to the bank. That night, they hid and waited. Soon, they saw Clay and his partner trying to break into the bank's vault. Holmes and the police quickly arrested them. Clay was a well-known criminal, and his plan had been a clever attempt to steal a lot of money. Mr. Wilson was shocked when he found out that his assistant had been using him. Holmes explained to him that the Red-Headed League was just a fake organization created to get him out of the shop so the criminals could work on their tunnel without being disturbed. Holmes's quick thinking and careful observation solved the case before any money was stolen. Watson admired Holmes's intelligence and attention to detail. Holmes simply smiled and said it was all a part of the job. In the end, Mr. Wilson was safe. The bank's money was secure, and another of London's criminals was put behind bars. This case showed once again why Sherlock Holmes was the greatest detective of his time. The next story is called A Case of Identity. One day, Dr. John Watson visited Sherlock Holmes at 221B Baker Street, eager to hear about any new cases. Holmes told Watson about a client who had just come to see him, a young woman named Miss Mary Sutherland. Miss Sutherland was a kind and somewhat naive woman. She told Holmes she was engaged to a man named Mr. Hosmer Angel, but he had mysteriously disappeared just before their wedding. She wanted Holmes to find him. Miss Sutherland explained that she lived with her mother and stepfather, Mr. Windybank. Her stepfather was strict and did not like her going out or meeting new people. However, when Mr. Windybank went on business trips, Miss Sutherland would go out to have fun. That was how she met Mr. Hosmer Angel at a party. Hosmer Angel was kind and caring, but he was very secretive. He always wore tinted glasses and spoke in a low voice. He also insisted that Miss Sutherland write letters to him at a post office box instead of his home address. The day of the wedding arrived, and Miss Sutherland was excited. However, Hosmer Angel did not show up at the church. She waited and waited, but he never came. She was heartbroken and confused, so she decided to come to Holmes for help. Holmes listened carefully and asked a few questions. He then promised Miss Sutherland that he would find out the truth. After Miss Sutherland left, Holmes shared his thoughts with Watson. He believed that Hosmer Angel was not a real person, but a disguise. Holmes suspected that Mr. Windybank, the stepfather, had created this character to trick Miss Sutherland. By pretending to be Hosmer Angel, Mr. Windybank could keep Miss Sutherland from marrying and taking her inheritance, which would mean less money for him and her mother. Holmes sent a letter to Mr. Windybank, asking him to come to Baker Street. When Mr. Windybank arrived, Holmes confronted him with the evidence. At first, Mr. Windybank tried to deny everything, but Holmes's sharp mind and logic left no room for doubt. Finally, Mr. Windybank admitted the truth. He had dressed up as Hosmer Angel to deceive Miss Sutherland. Holmes warned Mr. Windybank that while he could not be punished by law for what he had done, he should be careful, as people who deceive others often face serious consequences later. Watson was amazed by how quickly Holmes had solved the case. Miss Sutherland, however, never found out the truth. Holmes decided not to tell her, thinking it would save her from more pain. Holmes remarked to Watson that sometimes life is stranger than fiction. This case showed how far someone could go to be selfish and how important it was to see through lies and protect the innocent. The next story is the Boscombe Valley Mystery. One day, Dr. John Watson received a message from Sherlock Holmes asking him to join him on a trip to the countryside. Holmes was going to investigate a murder in Boscombe Valley and wanted Watson's company. The case was about the death of Mr. Charles McCarthy, a farmer who was found dead near a lake on his property. The main suspect was his own son, James McCarthy. Witnesses said they saw James arguing with his father just before the murder. James was arrested, but he insisted he was innocent. When Holmes and Watson arrived, they met with Inspector Lestrade, who explained the situation. James admitted he had argued with his father, but said he left before any violence occurred. He claimed he saw someone nearby, but could not identify who it was. Holmes and Watson went to the crime scene to look for clues. Holmes studied the ground carefully and found some interesting evidence. Footprints of different sizes and signs that someone had hidden behind a bush. They then spoke to a young woman named Miss Alice Turner, who was close to James and believed in his innocence. Alice's father, Mr. John Turner, was a wealthy neighbor and an old friend of Charles McCarthy. Alice told Holmes that James and his father often argued, but she was sure James would never harm his father. Holmes put all the clues together and discovered the truth. He learned that Mr. John Turner had a dark past. Many years ago, Turner had been involved in criminal activities, but had reformed and become wealthy. Charles McCarthy knew about Turner's past and was using it to blackmail him. McCarthy wanted his son, James, to marry Alice, but Turner did not approve. On the day of the murder, McCarthy threatened Turner, who, out of desperation, killed him. Holmes confronted Mr. Turner with the evidence. Turner, who was very ill, confessed to the crime. He told Holmes that he did it to protect his daughter from a forced marriage and to end the blackmail. Holmes decided not to report Turner to the police, as Turner was already dying and had acted to protect his family. Holmes explained everything to Inspector Lestrade, who agreed to let the case go given the circumstances. James McCarthy was released, and Holmes kept the details of Turner's confession private. Watson was amazed at how Holmes had solved the case with such skill. Holmes remarked that justice sometimes needs to consider more than just the law. The case ended with James free and Alice safe, thanks to Holmes' insight and compassion. The next story is The 5 Orange Pips. One rainy evening, Dr. John Watson was with Sherlock Holmes at 221 B. Baker Street when a young man named John Openshaw came to see them. He looked anxious and nervous. Holmes welcomed him and asked him to share his story. John explained that his family had faced strange and frightening events. It all started with his uncle, Elias Openshaw, who had lived in America but moved back to England. Elias was a mysterious man and had strange habits. One day, he received an envelope with 5 orange pips inside and a note that said KKK. Elias became very scared and locked himself in his room. A few days later, he was found dead in what seemed like an accident, but John believed it was more than that. After Elias's death, John's father, Joseph Openshaw, took over the estate. A year later, Joseph also received an envelope with 5 orange pips and the same KKK note. He laughed it off, thinking it was a joke. However, he died soon after in a mysterious accident as well. Now, John had inherited the estate. Just a few days ago, he too received an envelope with 5 orange pips and a note that said, "Put the papers on the sundial." John was terrified and came to Holmes for help. Holmes listened carefully and promised to help. He asked John to go home and do nothing for now. Holmes began investigating, going through old records and thinking deeply about the KKK initials. He discovered that they stood for the Ku Klux Klan, a violent group from America. Elias Openshaw had been involved with them and took important documents when he left the U.S. The pips were a warning to return the papers. Holmes planned to act quickly, but it was too late. The next morning, Watson brought news that John Openshaw's body had been found in a river. Holmes was angry that he couldn't save John in time. Determined to find justice, Holmes continued his investigation. He discovered that a ship called the Lone Star from America was connected to the case. He sent a warning to the ship's captain, using the same method, an envelope with 5 orange pips. Holmes hoped this would bring fear to those responsible. Months later, Holmes and Watson read in the news that the Lone Star had sunk at sea with no survivors. Although he couldn't bring John back, Holmes felt a sense of justice had been served. Watson admired Holmes's relentless pursuit of truth. This case showed that even the greatest detective couldn't always prevent tragedy, but he could still fight for justice and stand against evil. Now, the story of The Man with the Twisted Lip. One evening, Dr. John Watson was at home when his wife's friend, Mrs. St. Clair, came to see him. She was very upset and worried about her husband, Mr. Neville St. Clair, who had gone missing. Watson comforted her and decided to go with her to Sherlock Holmes for help. When they arrived at 221B Baker Street, Holmes listened carefully as Mrs. St. Clair shared her story. She explained that her husband was a kind and caring man. He had left for work one morning and promised to return by the evening. However, he did not come home. Mrs. St. Clair had seen him briefly in a window of an old building in a rough part of town called Upper Swandam Lane. She called out to him, but he disappeared from sight. Mrs. St. Clair ran to the building and found it was a place known for beggars and trouble. The only person there was a man named Hugh Boone, a beggar with a twisted lip. He was well known in the area for his red hair and deformed face. The police searched the building and found Mr. St. Clair's coat and some blood stains, but no sign of him. Hugh Boone was arrested on suspicion of harming Mr. St. Clair, but he denied knowing anything about it. The police believed Mr. St. Clair had been harmed or killed, but there was no proof. Holmes visited Upper Swandam Lane and examined the scene himself. He thought deeply and looked at every detail. Later that night, Holmes suddenly had an idea. He asked Watson to join him at the jail where Hugh Boone was being held. At the jail, Holmes asked the guards to bring Boone to a room with water and soap. The guards were confused, but followed Holmes's instructions. Holmes washed Boone's face, revealing that he was actually Mr. Neville St. Clair in disguise. Mr. St. Clair explained that he had been living a secret double life. Although he had a respectable job, he found that pretending to be a beggar brought in more money than his regular work. He had kept this secret from everyone, even his wife. The day Mrs. St. Clair saw him in the window, he panicked and hid. When the police came, he continued to pretend to be Hugh Boone to avoid suspicion. Holmes promised to keep Mr. St. Clair's secret as long as he stopped begging and returned to his normal life. The police released Mr. St. Clair, and Mrs. St. Clair was relieved to have her husband back, safe and sound. Watson was amazed by Holmes's ability to see through the mystery. This case proved that not everything is as it seems, and that even the strangest situations can have simple explanations. The next story is The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle. One winter morning, Dr. John Watson visited Sherlock Holmes at 221B Baker Street. Holmes was examining an old hat and a goose that had been left behind by a man after a small scuffle on the street. A police officer named Peterson had found them and brought them to Holmes, hoping the detective could find their owner. Holmes told Watson that the hat was worn and not very valuable, but it had some clues about its owner. The man was likely middle-aged, once wealthy but now struggling. Watson was curious about the goose, but Holmes said it was of little interest, at least until Peterson returned with surprising news. Peterson had taken the goose home for his family to eat. When they cut it open, they found a shiny blue gem inside. Peterson brought the gem back to Holmes, who immediately recognized it as the famous Blue Carbuncle, a valuable jewel that had been stolen from the Countess of Morcar a few days earlier. Holmes decided to solve the mystery of how the gem ended up inside the goose. He and Watson went to a local market where the goose had been purchased. They spoke to the seller, who said he bought his geese from a breeder named Mrs. Oakshott. Holmes and Watson visited Mrs. Oakshott and learned that the goose had been part of a group given to her brother, James Ryder, who worked at the hotel where the gem was stolen. Holmes realized that James Ryder was involved in the theft. Holmes invited Ryder to Baker Street and confronted him. Ryder, scared and ashamed, confessed that he had stolen the gem and hidden it inside a goose to smuggle it out safely. However, he had accidentally mixed up the geese, and the one with the gem ended up with someone else. Ryder begged Holmes for mercy, saying that he had never committed a crime before, and that this mistake had ruined him. Holmes decided not to turn him into the police. reasoning that sending Ryder to jail would not help anyone, and that Ryder had learned his lesson. Watson was surprised, but he respected Holmes's decision. The blue carbuncle was returned to the Countess, and the case was closed. Holmes reminded Watson that it was good to sometimes show mercy and give people a chance to change. This unusual case showed Holmes's sharp mind and his understanding of human nature. Even in the most unexpected situations, he could see the truth and make decisions that balanced justice with compassion. The Adventure of the Speckled Band. One morning, a young woman named Helen Stoner visited Sherlock Holmes at 221B Baker Street. She looked pale and frightened. Holmes, with Dr. Watson by his side, welcomed her and asked what was wrong. Helen explained that she lived with her stepfather, Dr. Grimsby Roylott, in a large old house. Dr. Roylott was an angry and violent man. Helen's sister, Julia, had died under mysterious circumstances 2 years ago, just before she was about to be married. Julia's last words were, "It was the speckled band." Helen did not understand what that meant. Now, Helen was engaged to be married, and strange things were happening again. Her room was being repaired, so she had to sleep in Julia's old room. One night, she heard a low whistle and a metallic sound, just like Julia had described before her death. Helen was terrified and came to Holmes for help. Holmes and Watson agreed to visit her home that evening. When Dr. Roylott appeared at Baker Street to confront Holmes, he threatened the detective. But Holmes remained calm and unafraid. That night, Holmes and Watson traveled to Helen's house. Helen showed them Julia's room. Holmes noticed several odd things. A fake bell rope that didn't work. A vent that connected Julia's room to Dr. Roylott's. And a bed bolted to the floor. Holmes asked Helen to stay in another room for her safety. He and Watson waited in the dark, silent and tense. Suddenly, they heard a quiet whistle and saw a small, slithering movement. Holmes quickly struck at the bell rope with his cane, and a snake, the speckled band, fell to the floor. It was a poisonous snake that Dr. Roylott had been using to kill Julia, and now planned to use on Helen. The snake retreated back through the vent, and soon they heard a loud scream from Dr. Roylott's room. The snake had turned on him, and he was found dead. Holmes explained to Watson that Dr. Roylott had trained the snake to crawl through the vent and down the fake bell rope to bite his stepdaughters as they slept. He did this to prevent them from marrying and taking their inheritance money. With Dr. Roylott gone, Helen was safe, and the case was solved. Watson admired Holmes's cleverness and bravery. Holmes simply replied that justice had been served, even in an unexpected way. The Adventure of the Engineer's Thumb. One morning, Dr. John Watson was at home when a man named Victor Hatherley, an engineer, came to see him. Victor was pale, weak, and had a bandaged hand. Watson treated him and listened to his story. Victor said he had lost his thumb in a terrible incident the night before, and wanted Watson to take him to Sherlock Holmes. When they arrived at 221 B. Baker Street, Holmes was curious about Victor's story. Victor explained that he was an engineer who specialized in hydraulics. The day before, a man named Colonel Lysander Stark came to him with an urgent job offer. Colonel Stark took Victor to a secluded house in the countryside, saying they needed help fixing a hydraulic press. When Victor arrived at the house, he noticed that the windows were boarded up, making the place dark and mysterious. He met two other people there, a nervous woman who whispered a warning to him, and another man who assisted Colonel Stark. Victor was shown the press and began examining it. However, he soon realized that something was wrong. The press was not used for legitimate work. Instead, it was part of an illegal scheme to create counterfeit coins. Before Victor could escape, Colonel Stark attacked him and tried to kill him by turning on the press. Victor managed to free himself, but not before his thumb was crushed. The woman he had seen earlier helped him escape through a window, and he ran for his life, eventually reaching Watson's home. Holmes listened carefully and promised to investigate. He asked Victor to show him the house, but when they arrived, the place was burned down and empty. Holmes deduced that the criminals had fled after realizing their operation was discovered. Holmes explained that Colonel Stark and his associates had set up the press to make counterfeit coins and used Victor to fix it, intending to kill him afterward to keep their secret safe. The woman who had helped Victor was likely involved, but felt guilty about the plan. Although the criminals escaped, Holmes was satisfied that their illegal operation had been stopped. Victor was grateful to Holmes and Watson for their help and felt lucky to be alive. Watson admired Holmes' quick thinking and ability to piece the story together. This case reminded Watson that even the bravest people can be caught in dangerous and unexpected situations. The Adventure of the Noble Bachelor. One day, Lord Robert St. Simon, a well-known nobleman, came to see Sherlock Holmes at 221B Baker Street. Dr. John Watson was there as well, ready to assist Holmes. Lord St. Simon looked upset and explained that his new bride, Miss Hattie Duran, had disappeared on their wedding day. Lord St. Simon told Holmes that Hattie was an American heiress and they had just married at a grand ceremony. After the wedding, they returned home for a small reception. During the reception, Hattie seemed quiet and distracted. Soon after, she left the room and no one saw her again. Holmes asked Lord St. Simon for some details and learned that Hattie had dropped her bouquet in a strange way before she left. Holmes also asked about any unusual events before the wedding, and Lord St. Simon mentioned that Hattie had received a letter that made her upset. Holmes began his investigation by speaking with Inspector Lestrade, who had been looking into the case. Lestrade believed that Hattie had run away because she was unhappy with the marriage. Holmes, however, had another theory. Holmes and Watson visited Hattie's hotel and spoke to her maid, who mentioned that a man had visited Hattie just before the wedding. This man had a rough appearance and seemed familiar to Hattie. Back at Baker Street, Holmes gathered more information and put the pieces together. The next day, he surprised everyone by inviting Lord St. Simon, Inspector Lestrade, and a mystery guest to his home. The mystery guest turned out to be Hattie Duran herself, along with a man named Frank Moulton. Hattie explained that Frank was her true love. They had been engaged before, but Frank had gone missing and was believed dead. When he returned, Hattie was already set to marry Lord St. Simon. On the wedding day, Frank found Hattie, and she decided to leave with him. She sent the letter to Lord St. Simon to explain, but he did not receive it in time. Lord St. Simon was shocked, but accepted the truth. Hattie and Frank apologized, and Holmes assured everyone that there was no crime involved, just a misunderstanding and a reunion of true love. Afterward, Watson praised Holmes for his insight and understanding. Holmes said that love can sometimes lead to the most unexpected situations, and solving such cases required more than just logic. It required empathy and a keen eye for human behavior. The Adventure of the Baryl Coronet. One morning, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson were visited by a man named Alexander Holder. He was a well-known banker and looked very distressed. Mr. Holder explained that he had an urgent case for Holmes to solve. Mr. Holder told them that he had been entrusted with a valuable piece of jewelry called the Baryl Coronet, which belonged to a high-ranking noble. The coronet was made of gold and decorated with rare green beryl stones. To keep it safe, Mr. Holder took it home and locked it in his room. However, late at night, Mr. Holder heard a noise and found his son, Arthur, holding the coronet in his hands. 3 of the beryl stones were missing. Arthur refused to explain why he was holding the coronet and remained silent. Mr. Holder was heartbroken and believed his son had stolen the stones. Holmes agreed to investigate and visited Mr. Holder's house. He examined the room carefully and asked questions about the people who lived there. Besides Arthur, there was Mary, Mr. Holder's niece, who was fond of Arthur, and a maid named Lucy. Holmes noticed footprints and signs that someone had left through the window. Holmes gathered information and followed the clues. He discovered that Lucy, the maid, had a boyfriend who was a known criminal. Holmes deduced that Lucy had unlocked the window to let her boyfriend inside. He had stolen the stones and planned to sell them. Arthur had seen the thief and tried to stop him, which explained why he was holding the coronet when his father found him. However, Arthur stayed silent to protect Mary, whom he thought might be involved. Holmes tracked down the thief and retrieved the missing stones. He brought them back to Mr. Holder and explained everything. Mr. Holder was relieved to learn that Arthur was innocent and had only tried to protect the family. Watson was impressed by Holmes' ability to see the truth when others could not. Holmes reminded Watson that even the smallest details can reveal the biggest secrets, and that justice sometimes requires looking beyond appearances. The case of the Baryl Coronet showed how quickly suspicion can fall on the wrong person. But with patience and skill, the truth can come to light. The Adventure of Silver Blaze. One day, Dr. John Watson joined Sherlock Holmes on a trip to the countryside to investigate the disappearance of a famous racehorse named Silver Blaze and the murder of the horse's trainer, John Straker. Colonel Ross, the horse's owner, was worried about the upcoming race, as Silver Blaze was the favorite to win. The case was puzzling. Straker had been found dead on the moor, and Silver Blaze was missing. Near Straker's body, they found a strange knife and some footprints. Holmes and Watson visited the stables and learned that one of the stable boys had been drugged on the night of the disappearance. Holmes asked many questions and looked for clues, noticing details that others had missed. He also examined Straker's clothes and found that they were torn in an unusual way. Holmes visited the nearby house of a man named Silas Brown, who trained another racehorse. Brown acted suspiciously, but Holmes did not reveal his findings to Watson right away. Holmes explained his theory to Watson. Straker had planned to harm Silver Blaze to make money from a bet against the horse. Straker had taken Silver Blaze out to the moor, intending to injure the horse's leg using the special knife. However, Silver Blaze, sensing danger, had kicked Straker, causing his death. Holmes also discovered that Silas Brown had found Silver Blaze wandering on the moor and had hidden the horse to keep it for himself. Holmes convinced Brown to return the horse without revealing his involvement. On the day of the race, Silver Blaze was returned to Colonel Ross, who was shocked and grateful. The horse won the race, and Holmes explained the entire story to the Colonel and Watson. Watson admired Holmes's skill in solving the case and uncovering the truth. Holmes reminded Watson that it was often the simplest details, like the silence of a dog that did not bark, that could lead to the solution. The case of Silver Blaze showed how Holmes's sharp observation and logical thinking could solve even the most complex mysteries. The Adventure of the Cardboard Box. One summer day, Dr. John Watson visited Sherlock Holmes at 221B Baker Street. Holmes was deep in thought when a new case arrived. Inspector Lestrade had an unusual item: a cardboard box containing 2 human ears. The box had been sent anonymously to a woman named Miss Susan Cushing, who lived in Croydon. Miss Cushing was shocked and had no idea why she received such a gruesome package. Holmes agreed to take on the case and visited Miss Cushing's home. He noticed that she was a kind, older woman who had no enemies. Holmes examined the box and noted the handwriting on the address and the type of twine used to dye it. Holmes asked Miss Cushing if she had any family or connections who might be involved. She mentioned that she had 2 sisters, Sarah and Mary. Sarah had caused trouble in the past and had a difficult personality, while Mary had married married a sailor named Jim Browner. Holmes began to suspect that the case was linked to Jim Browner, Mary's husband. He learned that Mary and Jim had a troubled marriage due to jealousy and misunderstandings. Jim Browner was deeply in love with Mary, but her behavior had caused tension. Holmes discovered that Jim had been enraged after finding out about Mary's unfaithfulness and had acted in a moment of passion. Holmes pieced together that Jim Browner had sent the ears as a warning and a sign of what he had done. He had likely killed Mary and her lover and sent the ears to Sarah, but they were mistakenly delivered to Susan. Holmes and Watson reported their findings to Inspector Lestrade, who managed to track down Jim Browner. Browner confessed to the crime, explaining that his jealousy and Mary's betrayal had driven him to violence. He felt remorseful, but said he could not control his emotions at the time. Watson was saddened by the tragic story, and Holmes reflected on how human emotions could lead to devastating consequences. The case showed that behind even the most shocking crime, there could be a story of love, betrayal, and regret. The Adventure of the Stockbroker's Clerk. One day, Dr. John Watson visited Sherlock Holmes at 221B Baker Street. Holmes seemed restless, so Watson asked if there were any interesting cases. Holmes told Watson that they had a new client coming in, a man named Mr. Hall Pycroft, who had an unusual story to tell. When Mr. Pycroft arrived, he explained that he was a stockbroker's clerk who had recently lost his job. He was thrilled when a company called Mawson and Williams offered him a new position. However, before he could start, a man named Arthur Pinner approached him with an even better offer from the Franco Midland Hardware Company. The salary was much higher, and Mr. Pinner insisted he start immediately. Mr. Pycroft was excited, but soon felt uneasy. The office where he worked was nearly empty, and he noticed strange behavior from Mr. Pinner and his brother, who claimed to be managing the company. Mr. Pinner seemed nervous and kept asking if Mr. Pycroft had told anyone about his new job. Holmes listened carefully and decided that he and Watson should visit Mr. Pinner's office to investigate. When they arrived, they found Mr. Pinner in a panic. He was shocked to see Holmes and Watson and tried to end his own life, but they stopped him in time. Holmes revealed that Mr. Pinner and his brother were actually criminals using the empty office as a cover for a scheme. They had tricked Mr. Pycroft into working there to distract him while they robbed Mawson and Williams, the firm that had originally hired him. Holmes contacted the police, and the criminals were arrested. Mr. Pycroft was grateful to Holmes for uncovering the truth and saving him from being part of the plot. Watson admired Holmes's quick thinking and ability to piece together the clues. Holmes reminded Watson that criminals often go to great lengths to create elaborate deceptions, but with careful observation, the truth can always be found. The case of the stockbroker's clerk showed that even the most innocent situations could hide danger, and that being alert and questioning things was essential. The Adventure of the Gloria Scott. One day, Sherlock Holmes decided to tell Dr. John Watson about one of the earliest cases that made him realize he wanted to be a detective. It was called The Adventure of the Gloria Scott. Watson listened with great interest as Holmes began. Holmes explained that during his time at university, he met a friend named Victor Trevor. Victor invited Holmes to visit his father's estate, where Holmes impressed Mr. Trevor with his ability to deduce small details about people. One day, Mr. Trevor received a letter that made him visibly upset. Holmes noticed that Mr. Trevor's behavior changed, and he seemed nervous. Soon after, an old sailor named Hudson arrived at the estate. Mr. Trevor's mood grew worse, and he appeared frightened of Hudson. Holmes learned that Hudson had been part of a dark secret from Mr. Trevor's past. Years before, Mr. Trevor had been involved in a mutiny on a ship called the Gloria Scott. The ship had been carrying prisoners, and Mr. Trevor, whose real name was James Armitage, was one of them. During the voyage, the prisoners, led by Hudson and others, took control of the ship. The Gloria Scott was wrecked, but Mr. Trevor managed to escape and build a new life in England. Hudson had recently found Mr. Trevor and was blackmailing him, threatening to reveal the truth. The letter that upset Mr. Trevor was a warning that more trouble was coming. The stress became too much for him, and he suffered a heart attack. Before he died, Mr. Trevor told Victor the full story and left a written confession. Holmes helped Victor understand what had happened and advised him to be cautious. Watson was amazed by the story and the early display of Holmes's talents. Holmes reflected that the case showed him how powerful observation and deduction could be, and it set him on the path to becoming a detective. The adventure of the Gloria Scott taught Holmes that even the most hidden secrets can resurface, and that understanding human nature is just as important as solving puzzles. The Adventure of the Crooked Man. One day, Dr. John Watson visited Sherlock Holmes at 221B Baker Street. Holmes had just taken on a new case involving the death of Colonel Barclay, a respected officer. His wife, Nancy Barclay, was a key witness, but her story was strange and incomplete. Holmes explained to Watson that Colonel Barclay had died suddenly in his home. Witnesses said that he and Nancy had argued in their sitting room, and when the servants rushed in after hearing a cry, they found the colonel dead and Nancy unconscious. There were no signs of an intruder, but a small, curved animal footprint was found near the scene. Holmes and Watson went to the Barclay home to investigate. They spoke to the servants and examined the room where the colonel had died. Holmes noticed a few unusual things: an open window, a small wooden club, and the curious footprint. Holmes followed a lead that took him to an old soldier named Henry Wood. Henry was known to have a disfigured appearance, which earned him the nickname the Crooked Man. He had once served with Colonel Barclay during a campaign in India. Henry revealed the true story to Holmes and Watson. Years ago in India, Colonel Barclay had betrayed Henry to the enemy out of jealousy over Nancy's affection. Henry was captured and tortured, which left him with lifelong injuries and a twisted body. He managed to escape and return to England, but he never fully recovered. One night, Henry saw Nancy by chance and followed her home. He managed to speak to her through the window. When Colonel Barclay entered and saw Henry, he was shocked and enraged. The argument that followed led to Colonel Barclay collapsing from a heart attack brought on by shock and anger. The small footprint belonged to Henry's trained mongoose, which he had kept as a companion. Nancy had fainted from the stress, but she was not guilty of any crime. Holmes assured Henry that he would not be held responsible for the colonel's death, as it was due to natural causes. Watson admired Holmes's ability to find the truth in a complex and emotional case. This adventure showed that old wrongs and hidden secrets could have powerful consequences, but that justice could still be found in unexpected ways. And that's it for this series of stories. I'm sure I'll come back to Sherlock Holmes in the future. Stay tuned.